Good afternoon. I'm Carmen, and this is Angelique, and we'd like to start our time together with a prayer. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Prayer to Saint Joachim and Saint Anne. Good parents of the Blessed Virgin Mary, grandparents of our Savior Jesus Christ, when life seems barren, help us to trust in God's mercy. When we are lost in the desert, lead us to those whom God has called us to love. When we are ashamed, remind us that we are God's children. When we sin, lead us to do God's will. You know God's will for the family. Keep all families close to you. You who suffered without children, intercede for all infertile couples. You who trusted in God's will, help us to respect God's gift of fertility. You who gave birth to the Blessed Mother, inspire couples to be co-creators with God. Pray with us for the ministry of Catholic family life. God of our fathers, you gave Saints Anne and Joachim the privilege of being the parents of Mary, the mother of your incarnate Son. May their prayers help us to attain the salvation you have promised to your people. We ask this through Christ our Lord. Amen. Spirit. Well, thank you for having us. We're very pleased to be here. Can you help me with this? We're from Miami, Florida, so this weather is a little bit different than what we're used to back home. So we're getting used to the change here, and unfortunately we didn't bring warmer weather with us, so we're sorry about that. So we had a wonderful presentation by Dr. Stroud, and he really spoke about NAPRO and the wonderful opportunities and all those wonderful treatment options that we have. And we wanted to go into different ways that we can help and support couples, both, if you happen to be a couple who's experiencing infertility, and also just one of the most important things is for us to be informed, just as Catholics. The church has wonderful and beautiful teachings on this area of infertility, and unfortunately, we don't know enough about them, and we don't talk enough about them. So the most important thing is to become informed. And unfortunately, all statistics show that Catholic women are using assisted reproductive technology at the same rate as the rest of the population. So that means that we're not getting this message across to women and giving them all the options that they really have. Dr. Janet Smith, the Catholic theologian, she says that people must think that the Catholic Church is perverse because they think the church makes people have babies who don't want to have babies by, our views on contraception, and then people who want to have babies, we tell you, no, you can't have babies because we don't agree with IVF. So people don't understand what the Catholic Church actually teaches. So the church's, one of the main things is to maintain both the unitive and the procreative aspects of the marital embrace. That's something that, unfortunately, in our society, because of contraception, we've lost that link. So once you lose that link, it's very easy to fall into these other methods of, artificial reproductive technologies, because at that point, that unitive aspect hasn't, the procreative and the unitive aren't together. But the church is very clear that those need to remain. And it's not that any technology is not good because it's artificial or because it's, because of the science behind it. It's just the separating of these two different things. So we'll get into, there's a rule of thumb that the USCCB, the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops, has, which we'll talk about in a second. But one of the things that's most important to distinguish when we're looking at different treatment options that, a couple is presented with is, does this treatment option assist the couple in achieving a pregnancy? Or does it replace the couple in how they achieve a pregnancy, right? Does it bring in third parties, such as, a technician in a lab? Are they the ones who are taking the sperm and the egg and putting them together and then putting that into a mother's womb? That's replacing, right? Or are they assisting? Are they doing something, a surgery like the doctor said, where they're helping the woman, right? So the act still remains the same. And we need to remember that we as human beings, God created us differently. Obviously, we're created in the image and likeness of God, and we procreate. We don't reproduce. We have God present in, what we do, and we have to remember that it's not the same. God created us in a certain way, and he wanted us to procreate, including him in that procreation. So unfortunately, a lot of these different methods that are out there, they take that relationship with God out of the equation, right? People pay a lot of money and they go to these doctors who, as Dr. Stroud said, many of them are told this is your only way to achieve a pregnancy, this is the only way you will become parents, which is very difficult to hear, especially when you're undergoing, the hardship of infertility. And we rely on going to a doctor and we trust. We say, okay, this is a medical professional, I'm not a medical professional, and if they're telling me this is the only way I can do this, then we tend to trust them. And unfortunately, some, may just not know any better, but, they lead people astray, unknowingly, and us as Catholics, we need to be informed. We need to remind people also, if people are married in the Catholic Church, one of the vows that we take, and I know that when, you're doing marriage prep, you're not necessarily thinking about this, but we vow to receive children from God. That's one of the vows that we make as Catholic couples when we receive the sacrament. And unfortunately, the way we speak in society, right, we always say, oh, I'm going to have children. Like, I will have children 2 years after I'm married, once we have a house, once, I don't know, I've paid some of my college debt off, whatever, things that we say. And when we say we have, it's as if I'm the person in control, right? And we take God out of that equation, and children are a gift, and they're not a right. And that's hard to tell people. Like, people feel, oh, well, I have a right to have children, and we don't necessarily. And some people, the Catechism of the Catholic Church, it states that, there are people who just are called to service within the church, and that's what their calling is. Obviously, there's other couples who may be called to adopt, and both of us are adoptive moms, and we'll talk about that as well. But we can remind them about, the receiving of children. So the USCCB, the rule of thumb, like I said, it's any procedure which assists the marital couple in intercourse, and it helps them to achieve the procreative potential, is moral. So that's perfectly fine. But anything that adds a third party, like I said, a technician or the doctor in like an invasive way, or substitutes a laboratory procedure, then those are considered illicit. So those would be like in vitro fertilization, which that's where fertilization occurs in a glass, in a petri dish. So that's what in vitro means, glass in Latin. IUI, there's many different procedures that unfortunately they also have a lot of just ethical ramifications. And people don't think about these things, and unfortunately, people, when they're experiencing infertility, they're just focused on, okay, I want to have a baby and this is what I want to do, and they don't think about the consequences sometimes. And we know many couples, unfortunately, who have used these procedures, and then, for example, they have frozen babies. There's embryos that are frozen, and then what do they do with those babies? And I was just, somebody that I know is an acquaintance of mine, they have a child, and they decided that those frozen babies, they just couldn't do anything with them. They're just going to leave them there. And those are moral issues that people just don't think about. And those are people that are just kind of frozen there. And people use, the same couple actually used an egg donor. And donor is obviously sort of a misnomer, because donation implies that you're just doing something out of your own, like I donate something to the church, I'm not necessarily getting something in return, versus an egg donor receives lots of money for their egg donation. And these are, a lot of times they look to college women who have, they're at the peak of their fertility, and they look for certain criteria. They want, a certain SAT score. I mean, there's ads in college newspapers, especially in Ivy League schools. I mean, they target these women. And these women, they need money, they're in school, they have loans, and they go ahead with this, and they don't look at the implications later on. And these women, a lot of times they're hyper-stimulated, so they're ovulating like 20 eggs, something that God did not intend us to do. And then later on, they have all these health risks, like, for example, something that it may or may not be related, but Brittany Maynard, who probably most of you have heard about, the woman who decided to end her life because of terminal cancer. She was an egg donor, and there's some speculation that maybe, all those hormones that she took to be an egg donor at whatever point in her life that she did that, may have made her more susceptible to her cancer that eventually she had. So there's a lot of different issues associated, and we don't, it's a very slippery slope once we start to accept these different things. Like in the news this week, there was in Great Britain, they just decided that it was okay to have children with the DNA of 3 people. So they're going to go into this, procedure and somehow do this. And all these things, then they have to, they don't even know what the repercussions are, right? But everybody's, kind of playing God to some extent. So that's why the church wants us to be very cautious about what we do and think about and be informed about the choices that we make. So the church also looks at the holistic person, right? We're not just physical, a body, we have a spirit. So how do the choices that we make affect us spiritually, right? What are the ethical and moral ramifications of these choices? And as Dr. Stroud said, most of these procedures that most people end up using, they just look at a symptom, right? The infertility is a symptom, so they don't ever actually treat the problem of why a couple is infertile. And the Catholic Church, through NAPRO technology or different other methods, they want to look at what's the reason, like what is the underlying illness? Why is this couple not able to achieve a pregnancy? And how can we help them to achieve the pregnancy? And how can we do so in a way that doesn't compromise your faith, right? That you should never have to choose between your faith and your fertility. You should be able to be able to work with both and not have to make a choice. And the church actually has 2 major documents on the subject, or dealing with reproductive technology. One is Donum Vitae, and another one is Dignitas Personae. And Donum Vitae specifically says, the child has the right to be conceived, carried in the womb, brought into the world, and brought up within the marriage. So one of the things that a lot of these other procedures don't look at is the rights of the child, right? It just focuses on the parents. The parents are the ones who want to achieve a pregnancy. I want a baby, and I want a baby at whatever cost. But what about the rights of that child, right? We all have the same dignity. That child in the womb has just as much rights as the adults, who want to bring up the child. And also some of the treatments, because people pay, tens of thousands of dollars, they start to view the children as sort of a commodity, right? Like, I paid this doctor, $30,000. Well, I have a right to have a child. And that's not the way we need to view, anything. And we don't have a right to a child or a person or anything like that. And we're giving a lot of control to these doctors and also the parents. They also then start to have issues with, what if the child is not, perfect? What if the child has an issue? Then they view it as, well, if I paid all this money, well, then I should have a completely, healthy child, or, this child doesn't have as much of a right. So there's a lot of things that are implied and within this industry are done, like the euphemism of selective reduction, right? Because they'll implant many embryos, and then it's dangerous to have a pregnancy with, obviously a triplet pregnancy is more dangerous than a singleton. So we'll do selective reduction, which is, killing children. We'll just survival of the fittest. The ones that are not as good, those will kill. So it's a lot of different ethical issues that we have to think about, and the church is very concerned with us thinking about these things. And one of the things that is really important, and unfortunately people don't know about, is natural family planning. Sometimes people are just with that, with doing charts and learning about their fertility, they might be able to achieve a pregnancy. So just informing people about that could help them, in a very simple way and a very natural, holistic way. So for those experiencing infertility, so one of the most important things is obviously to not let other people tell you, okay, well, this is what you need to do, or this is the only option that you have. I mean, I myself have been there in doctor's offices where, a doctor's saying this is what you need to do, and I've had to, respectfully say, no, that's not what I need to do, but, I've been informed, and it's important that we inform others around us so that they feel that they do have choices as well. And remember that the NAPRO technology that we were just hearing about is basically twice as effective as these artificial reproductive technologies that the doctors really want us to use. And it's important to remember that a marriage, a family is that couple. If a couple has children, that's wonderful, but they're still a family, even if it's just the two of them. And there's a reason why, God brought you together, and you need to remain united. Sometimes it's difficult as a couple to deal with the infertility in the sense that maybe one of the two in the relationship has the infertility. That's the case in my marriage. But we're the two become one, right, when we get married. So it's not that my husband has the infertility issue. We are infertile. We have this issue, and we work through it together. And it's important to work on that because I don't want to blame and I don't blame my husband. And there can be a lot of issues, but we have to stay in constant communication, and that can be difficult. Sometimes we don't want to talk about it, and I will talk about the differences between men and women and our communication as well. And even for women also, sometimes the medications make us more susceptible to, like a heightened sense of anxiety or stress and things like that. And also as women, we're more aware, obviously, of our cycle, so we know what's going on, like, at a certain point, and men, I think, sometimes can disassociate a little bit from that, but we have to just continue working on that. And communication is extremely important. It's important to know where the other person stands, and that's one of the beauties of NFP, right? That with natural family planning, you have to communicate about where you are in a cycle, what it is that you want to do as a family. And also with infertility, you have to be communicating. You have to be knowing how the other person's feeling. Like maybe somebody doesn't want to continue with fertility treatments. Maybe one of you really feels the need, feels, okay, maybe we should pursue adoption. Or maybe we should just not do anything. You need to be constantly communicating. And it's hard because sometimes you may not be on the same page, and you may need to just pray for your spouse and see where God is leading you as a couple. And you may need to wait patiently for them to maybe, get to the same place you are, or, for both of you to, just be loving and respectful. And that can be very hard at times, especially in the midst of infertility. And also to relax together, to remember to spend time, going out and going to have dinner, things that you would do, when you were dating, before the infertility, just really it can take over your life, and it can take over like the focus of everything. And that's not what marriage is about. Work on your marriage, pray together, and praying together, both as a couple and also individually. As a couple, I know it can be difficult for some people to pray with their spouse. Sometimes it seems awkward to pray with them, but just we can hear, when somebody's praying, we can hear like basically what they're telling God, and maybe something they aren't willing to necessarily share with you, but in their prayer, they feel more comfortable, and they might be able to say something that can help you know how they're doing. And then also just individually, individual prayer life, praying for spouses, going to a reconciliation mass, obviously, and service in the church. It's amazing how when we're in pain, we just focus on ourselves, right? And if something hurts, like that's all you can think about. Like if your tooth hurts, you just think about your tooth hurting, like all the time. So when we're infertile and we just focus on that pain of infertility, you see a child and you just think about how, that's what you want and you don't have that. And you just focus on that. But, St. Paul, in the second letter to Timothy, he says that we are running the race while we wait. And we're not called to stop, we need to continue. While we're waiting for whatever it is God is calling an individual family to do, we are called to continue. And service in the church can be very healing. When we let go of ourselves and focus on other people who need, maybe it's premarital, the working on engaged encounter, or things like that, like things that you can do as a couple. will help you to, take away some of that focus on just the infertility and the pain that it causes. So, you can't stop worshiping and doing all these different things together. And also getting connected. It's amazing, about 1 in 6 couples in the United States will experience infertility. So chances are that either somebody you know or a friend of somebody is also experiencing this or knows somebody. So maybe you can start a group in your parish, a support group or something in the diocese, or you can do something. There's on Facebook, there's like a secret Facebook group that has a lot of support that people can post things and they talk about things. There's also a Yahoo group that's a little bit more, I guess, if you don't want to be as Facebook as, obviously people know who you are. It's not quite as secret, but you could do the Yahoo group or different ways that you can find support out there. There's a lot of people experiencing the same thing, and it's important to know that you're not alone. There's a lot of people out there. So one of the important things is that this is something that affects both spouses in a relationship. It's not just the woman. My husband actually wrote a chapter in our book, but just to make the point that this is very difficult for men to talk about, despite the fact that there's a chapter, so there's a nice number of pages written by him in a book. He has never actually spoken about this topic. And I don't know that he really would want to either. Obviously, he's supportive of me doing so, but yet that stigma is still there, right? Even though he's done this, and obviously he's put himself out there. It's not like it's clearly published. But despite that, I was even asking him, has he ever spoken about this? I was like, I don't think so. He hasn't, and even in talking to me about it, he doesn't like to. He'll generally tell me, as women, we like to talk more, obviously. We like to work out our problems by talking, and men, not so much. So generally, my husband will say something to the effect of, talking will not solve the problem, it will not help, and so he just kind of leaves it there. He will be proactive to the extent that he needs to be in this, if he needs to take a medication or do something, he's willing to do that. But he doesn't feel the need, obviously, to have a support group or do anything like that. It's just not something he feels very, very comfortable doing. And I think, as a wife, I've had to learn to understand that, and I've had to learn to be supportive of him as well and be patient with him. Just like sometimes he needs to know that when I talk, I don't want a solution. I just want to vent, and I just want to say what I want to say. But I don't need him to give me 50 solutions to what I'm saying. And he's had to learn to, kind of just stay quiet sometimes and just let me speak my mind. So we're different, and it affects us both in a different way, but that doesn't mean it affects us less, right? Just because it affects him differently, I don't think it's not that it's affecting him to the same degree, just in a different manner. So we have to just keep that in mind and be patient with each other. God created us to be complementary. We're not the same. It's part of the beauty and the challenge of marriage, right? My husband and I are very different. I'm actually an introvert, and I'm standing up here speaking to you, but I'm more of a quiet, reserved person, and my husband is the kind who is just, very extroverted, but yet doesn't really speak about deeper issues. But he's just likes to make jokes and that kind of thing. But we're very different, so he's more likely to make jokes about things than get serious. So we have to just be patient and remember that. To honor each other, that's one of the things that we vowed to do when we got married, and honor each other, even in the struggle of infertility.
Okay, well, as Carmen was saying, 1 out of 6 couples in the United States faces infertility. And so chances are, if we're not experiencing it ourselves, we do know someone who is. And so a subject that's very near and dear to my heart is just, what do we do if we have a friend who is experiencing infertility? How do we support that person? We had the pleasure of having dinner last night with two lovely ladies who work for the diocese here, and you know, they were talking to each other at one point, and one said, "Hey, did you ever get to watch that movie I lent you?" And she said, "Well, yeah, no, well, I kind of fast forwarded to the parts that I didn't like, to the parts that were a little hard to watch." And isn't that how we are? It's kind of hard to watch a friend struggling. It's kind of hard to watch our spouse struggling, someone that we love. It's hard to watch and seemingly not be able to do anything about it. But I do think that there's a lot that we can concretely do to support our friends during their suffering. First of all, it's important to understand how infertility can affect a marriage. For starters, there's a high rate of divorce among people who are experiencing this. You know, imagine a couple who's thrown everything they've got into IVF and IUI to come out with nothing, and the hormones that affect that, and just all the emotions that go into that. In many cases, you know, that marriage ends up emotionally and spiritually bankrupt. And we actually know a couple who was involved on the board of the Spanish language marriage prep, you know, at home. And you know, they obviously had a strong marriage in that, you know, they were serving in the church and whatnot, and unfortunately, partially because of the experience of infertility, that marriage dissolved. So, you know, it's very tough. People need to realize that this is a very sensitive and difficult subject for marriages. There's also a big sense of disappointment and shame in such a public cross. Now, it's interesting because the experience of infertility is obviously something that is very private to some degree. But it is so public, and I want to even say that even more so in Catholic circles, when so many families do have so many children. And you know, it's hard to kind of field the questions of, oh, when's it your turn? When am I going to have grandchildren? And when, you know, all those things, I think that people are essentially well-intentioned, but unfortunately a lot of those things come off as very hurtful. So we have to be very sensitive and very careful with how we approach things. If we do have friends who have been experiencing infertility, it's not to say that we shouldn't touch the subject. To the contrary, you know, we don't want it to be the elephant in the room. I think that the important thing is to approach those people and say, hey, you know, I've noticed you guys have been married, you know, X number of years. You know, is it, you know, are you having trouble conceiving? Is there any way that I can help? Can I pray for you? I think that ignoring the problem is one of the worst things we can do, but approaching it sensitively is essential. Sometimes reproductive problems aren't anticipated. I mean, some of us know that we have PCOS or that we have endometriosis, and so we know that there might be that possibility when and if we get married. But for some of us, we're completely blindsided. You know, I had, you know, regular periods, you know, thought, you know, there's not going to be any issue when we decide that it's time to welcome children into our home. Well, that didn't happen that way. You know, I felt blindsided. As a matter of fact, the word I use is indignant. I struggled for a while wondering if God was calling me to be a mom, and then when it was so hard to conceive, I said, yeah, you know, I was right. God doesn't want me to be a mom. And so that was really hard to deal with those emotions and that pain of thinking, you know, here I finally came around to saying, okay, God, you know, thy will be done, and it was my will that I wanted done. And so that's something that we have to be aware about also when facing infertility. You know, one of the good things that we have as a resource in the Catholic Church is to be able to have counselors or spiritual directors or priests who are well versed in this area, who can help accompany people. Now, I do make sure to mention the caveat that they are people who are well formed. Unfortunately, we have heard of situations of priests who have told a couple, you know, do whatever your conscience tells you with regard to treatments, and that's very difficult. But I'm so happy that so many in the church now are knowledgeable about the theology of the body, are knowledgeable about these teachings, and we can do our part also to make sure that people in the church are faithful and are understanding of these teachings of the church. And they are hard teachings. You know, any good teaching is any teaching that challenges us to love as Christ does is difficult. But counseling can provide such wonderful opportunity to be able to get the word out about these teachings that aren't necessarily as well known. You know, the problem is that we can't necessarily assume that a couple's conscience is not just formed, but informed. And so that's why it's important to have these tools and resources available. In your bags, you should have copies of some documents that we put together that not just talks about the actual documents that she mentioned that the church has put out about the subject, but also documents for family life ministers, for parish members who want to support people, how to do a mass, for instance, which I'll talk a little bit about in a little bit. But essentially, there's all these resources, and the important thing is just to get it out there. And so we recommend either on a parish website to put it up. Sometimes that anonymity is a little bit more comfortable for people who are bearing this cross. But it's also a good opportunity just to pass it along to a friend who we know might be experiencing infertility. As Carmen was saying, couples who are facing this and go to doctors aren't necessarily going to get the best possible information from their doctors. Very few, as Dr. Stroud mentioned, like he is one of few doctors who actually practice, holistic NFP only medicine, and we're going to be told a bunch of things we don't want to hear. When we were first facing it and we got tested, we came back as, unexplained infertility, which is, such a helpful diagnosis in the sense that what are you supposed to do with that, And our doctor, who is Catholic, said, well, and he knows my views, actually I've known him for many years. My OB said, well, there's always IUI, but I assume you wouldn't want to do that. And it was said sort of flippantly and said, it was a challenge to me actually, because at the time I didn't know anyone who had experienced this. And so it was sort of like a lonely place. And it was a challenge to me to say, well, yeah, no, I wouldn't want to do that, but why? I didn't know why. I didn't know what document. I knew the church was against it, but I didn't know why. And so I challenge all of you to read these documents. Maybe we know the church does not want us to do this, but don't understand where they arrive at the conclusion that we shouldn't. And so read the documents and then challenge your friends also, lovingly of course, to read through what the church has to say about it, because it is so beautiful. And it is such a challenging but loving teaching that we can learn from and realize that what the church wants is for us to uphold our dignity and that of our spouses and future children, God willing. It's a rare thing in today's society to find friends who challenge one another. I think a lot of time we just have this blasé attitude of like, well, you do your thing and I do mine, and I'm not going to interfere. Whatever makes you happy is thrown around a little bit too often. And I think our challenge as friends in the Lord and as friends who practice our faith is to say, sympathy's nice, right? But what about challenging our friends and saying, it's very easy in infertility to throw ourselves a pity party. But let's look at the positives of this. Let's look at what fruit has come of this. Perhaps we've increased our relationship with God. We need to exhort our friends. And one powerful way, when we were interviewing people for our book, I'll never forget this, and we use it often in our presentations. A friend said that when she changed the question and asked herself, do I want to be pregnant or do I want to be a mother? That was the game changer for her. And so sometimes we get so wrapped up in the pain of infertility that we don't realize some of the more obvious questions. And so there's, obviously we came about also that way of motherhood partially through adoption. And so there's many ways to come about being a parent. So I think sometimes we have to be a little bit more willing to challenge our friends and ourselves to look outside the box. As I mentioned before, we have to not be afraid to talk about infertility. We need to be very respectful though. It may have been, it's the first day of the cycle and the woman is absolutely destroyed. She may not want to talk about it, and we can't force anybody to talk about it. But giving them the opportunity to talk about it and say, hey, if you want to talk, I'm here, goes a very long way, because again, it's not the elephant in the room that we're ignoring. I think sometimes people are hesitant to help other people if they haven't experienced infertility themselves. Just because you may have a slew of kids doesn't mean that you can't be sensitive to the suffering of someone else. And so, to the contrary, sometimes those can be the most helpful people. It's a matter of knowing that suffering exists, and we all have to face suffering in different ways, and this is the particular cross of this particular couple. But we can be extremely empathetic and extremely loving and supportive of a couple experiencing infertility, whether or not we've experienced it ourselves. A good thing to do is just distract them, take them out for coffee, go for a walk, do some exercise together, motivate each other to train maybe for a marathon or something, something that will take attention away from infertility, which, as Carmen said, can be all-consuming. When you have to chart all your temperatures and go for daily blood draws and all the time and the emotion that goes into that, coffee with a friend or ice cream or brownie or whatever floats your boat is a definite welcome respite from that. It's nice also to know that you're being thought about and prayed about. A little email every so often with an encouraging word, a word from scripture, a song you heard on the radio that, offers some hope. Things like that help to know people, you're there for them without necessarily imposing and always being, on top of them to talk or whatever. And then there's a lot of things that we can do at the parish level or at the diocesan level to make sure that we're not forgetting this very important suffering that's taking place more and more every day all around us. Mother's Day and Father's Day is coming up. It'll be here before we know it. And that is among the hardest days for people facing infertility. To know that on Sunday Mass, the priest is going to ask the mothers to stand up for a blessing, and you want nothing more than to be a mother, and you're sitting there in tears. I think it goes such a long way if the priest just includes in the general intercessions, you include a prayer for people who long to conceive but have been unable to, for people who are spiritual mothers or fathers, of course, in the case of Father's Day, or not necessarily having them stand, or just pray for all women, or for there's just ways about it, and I think every parish and every diocese can do that in a particular way that works best for them. But the point is to just not ignore this population and to know that they're being thought of on this difficult day. Sometimes people may come to the Family Life Office or to the Respect Life Office or the Natural Family Planning Office and ask for resources. You are more than welcome to photocopy the resources that we provided. We are a resource as well. We have our business cards on the back. Please do, you can contact us anytime if you have any questions. Pass on our information to people struggling with this. And maybe create a little care package with brochures on the Creighton model, on NAPRO technology, information about where they can get information online, the documents, anything that goes a long way. St. Gerard Magella is known as one of the patron saints of people experiencing infertility. A little prayer card, just a little care package so that people know that they are being prayed for. Planning an infertility mass or prayer service or night of reflection, again, whatever works for your area or for your parish, is a nice way to be remembered also. We've attended a few, we planned one in our diocese. Having readings that tell the stories, for instance, of Sarah or Hannah or Elizabeth, women who faced infertility in the Bible. And as an aside, sharing those stories with friends, just sharing them, we just forget them. We forget so much of Scripture. Just having, how these women dealt with infertility in different ways is really helpful as well. But anyway, as I was saying, a Mass that includes those readings and that has then a blessing, for instance, a healing blessing that the priest does over the couples. Or then there's like a reception afterward, and you can do like NAPRO technology tables or different things like adoption, different things that serve as resources to help people. And of course, this is something that we should be discussing in marriage prep. When you're faced in that moment, you're not necessarily thinking clearly. I think all marriage prep programs should include the very basic question of, if we are faced with infertility, what are we as a couple going to do about it? Because when you're in that moment and the emotions are raw, it's very hard to make a clear decision sometimes. And with regard to helping make decisions, we have a chapter in our book on discernment. And it uses the tools that the Church has given us to the history of our tradition and the spirituality of St. Ignatius to help us arrive at a decision that we can do together, and a decision with God, including God in the decision making. How are we going to proceed? Are we going to do treatments? Are we not going to do any treatments? Are we going to adopt? What are we feeling called to do? And so I think providing those resources is very essential for couples. There's also support groups. We have some resources in there on support groups. And priests play such a huge role in this, and God bless those of you who are here. We thank you. I think that priests can be that first line of defense where couples go and say, we have this decision to make, we don't know where to go, this is what we're experiencing. First, to pray for the people to be faithful. And just to provide them the resources and the information. We've heard people, this is, I promise, not a shameless plug for the book, because we want you to just get the information, but people have given our books to priests so that they're informed. Or they've donated them to the parish library. We certainly just hope that people be informed about these teachings. And of course, the most important thing you can do is just to pray for a couple. And if you know them well enough, pray for them. Ask, what can I pray for specifically? They may have a meeting with an adoption worker coming up, or they may have a really crucial appointment that's going to tell them how to, how they should proceed with treatment. That praying for something specifically helps you feel like someone's on your team and is on your side. So the topic of miscarriage. Neither of us has personally experienced one, but we have certainly, in the process of writing our book and preparing presentations, spoken to many women who have, and it is a real loss. And I think, unfortunately, there's this tendency whether subconsciously or just because of the pain and the difficulty of dealing with death, that we minimize it. We tend to societally minimize it. And I think it's ironic, given that as a church we're so pro-life and so against abortion, that we recognize the challenge of a child dying in the womb. And when that's done intentionally, it's horrible. But when it happens by happenstance, a lot of times we're not there to support the women who so desire these children, these men and women, that then they lose this child. And so I think as a church there's much more that we can do to support people who are experiencing this. Statistically, it can happen in as many as 1 in 4 pregnancies. And infertility and miscarriage in many cases go hand in hand, because sometimes the couple is able to conceive finally after years of infertility, but then it's difficult for the couple to sustain that pregnancy. And so, as the doctor mentioned, there is testing that can be done to see if it's repeated miscarriage, what it is genetically or what it is hormonally that's going on in the woman to help her sustain that pregnancy. And there are things that can be done. And again, that is very pro-life. There's a blogger, there's a lot of Catholic bloggers who are faithful to the magisterium who blog about their experiences. And so we encourage you to look those up. We have a list of them as well. It's just a really good way for people to share their experiences, share their treatments, and support one another. There's a really nice community that's been formed nationwide. And one of them is very interesting because she experienced primary infertility, secondary infertility, and is an adoptive mother, and then recently also experienced miscarriage. So she's run the gamut of experiences, and she writes beautifully and has a lot of things to share of her wisdom. And one of the things she shared when she had her miscarriage in her particular diocese in Virginia, the Knights of Columbus sponsor an ecumenical funeral service for people who have infant loss or miscarriage. And I mean, just the pictures is so moving, as like the tiny caskets, and it's heartbreaking. But what they're doing is they're doing the corporal works of mercy, of burying the dead, and recognizing that these are children, that these are lives that have been lost. And it's just a beautiful, beautiful ministry. And the closure and the hope and the healing that brought that family is incredible. And so many people don't know, especially when you're faced with that sorrow in that moment, that there are things that can be done, that the baby can be buried. A lot of times hospitals won't tell the family this. And so it's important for us to know this information, because if we know someone who's facing this, we can say, hey, you can have a Christian burial for this baby. And so the Catechism tells us, number 1261, as regards children who have died without baptism, the Church can only entrust them to the mercy of God, as she does in her funeral rites for them. Indeed, the great mercy of God, who desires that all men should be saved, and Jesus' tenderness toward children, which caused him to say, let the children come to me, do not hinder them, allow us to hope that there is a way of salvation for children who have died without baptism. I mean, unfortunately, children who have died in utero cannot be baptized, but the Church understands that if there's that desire, that they can have a Christian funeral. If the miscarriage took place in a hospital, for instance, it's important to request that the remains be retreated respectfully and that they turn the remains into the parents so that they can have a proper Christian burial. This is not something that a lot of people know about, and this can be done. And sometimes if that miscarriage takes place before the 20 weeks, when sometimes it is more possible to have the remains be able to be salvaged, I guess. Any sort of prayer service, anything that helps the family spiritually with healing is highly recommended. So it's something to keep in mind. It's also something in the same way that there can be an infertility mass. In October is Infant Loss and Miscarriage Awareness Month. There can be a mass that's held to remember those souls that have been lost in that diocese or in that parish throughout the year. Another appropriate day might be the Mass of the Innocents that can be done around the Feast of the Holy Innocents, December 28th. And of course, support groups are always helpful for couples experiencing this, for men or women. So those are some suggestions. So switching gears a little bit to adoption, I think, kind of no conversation about this can be complete without discussing adoption. It's a topic that's very important to us. We're both adoptive moms, as we mentioned. Carmen has boy-girl twins, who are 3, who are incredibly energetic and a lot of fun. And my eldest son is 8. Her kids were adopted domestically. Ours we adopted from Vietnam. He's fantastic. We have since had children biologically as well, and he's an amazing big brother. And the journey of adoption for us was one that we didn't arrive at lightly, when we had our unexplained infertility diagnosis. Again, through the research that we were doing, we discovered naprotechnology, and so we had the debate, okay, do we try to diagnose and see if there's something underlying that we haven't found, or are we called to adopt? And we just felt very strongly through our process of discernment that we were being called to adopt our son. And God opens doors and throws them open when he really wants things done. And we had our international adoption done in a year, which is unheard of. And her twins were adopted in 6 months. I mean, God is funny. It's not to say that all adoptions take place this way, but we felt that this is God clearly telling us this is the way you're supposed to go. So we went to a women's conference recently, and Dr. Ray Gurendi, who we heard is from the state, was speaking, and he is the adoptive father of 10. So it was like a question and answer session, and they said, what if, we're not called to adopt? And he's like, not called to adopt? James 1:27, religion that is pure and undefiled before God and the Father is this, to care for orphans and widows in their affliction, and to keep oneself untainted by the world. So we are called to adopt. It's written, it's in God's word. We can't neglect that. Now, does that necessarily mean that we're all personally invited to bring an adopted child into our home? Maybe not, but we all can do something to help the orphans in the world. If we ourselves don't feel that personal call, we as a church need to be much more supportive of creating an adoption culture within our church. Again, we're as pro-life as it gets, right? I heard someone mention that you guys are honoring or celebrating the 40 days of life. And absolutely, but life is not just the issue of abortion. And let's say, obviously, these are tied hand in hand. If we want people to give up children for adoption as an alternative to abortion, what are we as a church doing to support those, A, who are choosing life, and B, who then choose to adopt those children from those who have chosen life? Our Protestant brothers and sisters do an amazing job of putting out materials and creating this culture of adoption. There's entire churches who adopt from an entire village. It's just, again, this may or may not be our call, but I think that we do have that biblical call and can do more to support adoption in our church. And one of the myths or one of the difficulties that people have, I think, is the financial aspect. I think, again, this is where God provides. We had the blessing of having an adoption tax credit. This is something that's provided by the IRS, and every year it changes. And so we got some money from there, and then my husband's employer at the time gave like adoption bonuses or scholarships, and so we didn't have everything covered, but certainly a fair amount of it was. And in Carmen and Alex's case, as I said, the IRS changes the way they do it every year, and they have to reassess it every year. But the particular year that they adopted their children, that they finalized their adoption, they had some great rebate, and in the end they had every single penny of the adoption of their twins covered. And that wasn't planned ahead of time, obviously. It's not like, I think we'll adopt this year because there's this possibility. No, this is God opening doors and windows to make this possible. And so we just never know. Sometimes we have to take a leap of faith and realize that the financial aspect or whatever myth or whatever, are they going to be loved by my family? Kind of just step out in faith, as the doctor said, and realize that, God provides. We found that once one family adopts, you all of a sudden see what adoption looks like, and it becomes less stigmatized and it becomes less scary. We have the blessing of having in our church community or just in our group of friends a bunch of adopted children, and this helps those of our children who are adopted to know that they're not alone, that there's other families going through this, and for us who as parents to kind of commiserate and talk to about whatever special challenges arise from adoption. So it really is a blessing, and we encourage you, if you're experiencing infertility, to pray about it. And if you know someone who is, to ask them to pray about it and to listen to what God has to say. Couples who experience infertility can be a tremendous source of hope in a society that in many cases is hopeless. They, a lot of times I think our society is sort of insensitive to the pain of infertility because we tout this quick fix of IVF and we'll just get you a baby and done. No, the pain in the cross is real, and thankfully we have the cross of Christ to be our model. They think about the witness that we can be as couples experiencing infertility, to stand firm in our faith and in our values and say, no, we're going to respect life, even if it's the harder journey, even if it's carrying the cross with Christ. We believe that a baby is conceived together with God and not in a lab with a tech. And so we just wanted to conclude with this prayer passage from Mother Teresa. She says, I used to pray that God would feed the hungry or do this or that, but now I pray that he will guide me to do whatever I'm supposed to do, what I can do. I used to pray for answers, but now I pray for strength. I used to believe that prayer changes things, but now I know that prayer changes us and we change things. So we are happy to answer any questions that you may have.
Obviously, the focus of the day is on infertility and infertility. If you were to give a talk to 18-year-old girls and you were going to speak to them about what they can control as far as fertility, the endometriosis and the polycystic disease, that for the most part that's beyond our control. But things they can control, what advice would you give to them looking ahead 5 to 15 years to have them basically control what they can as far as their own fertility?
Either one, both.
Well, one thing that I would definitely say is I think that society tells us, oh, you can wait however long, to have children, or, especially, teenage girls, it's like, okay, you're empowered, and, like, I'm an attorney, and honestly, we made a choice, and it was, I believe, a prayerful discernment at the time that while I went back to graduate school, once I was married. As my husband says, he wouldn't have married me if he knew I would be a lawyer, but nonetheless, he stuck with me. So I went back to school, and during that time, we discerned that, we would postpone achieving a pregnancy. So, there are times when I look back and I'm like, was that the right choice? Because I was obviously at a more fertile point in my, God designed women with a certain, our fertility does decline with time. So I think sometimes girls are told, you can postpone and you can do like now, was it Facebook or no? There's some
Google,
Facebook, some company that they're doing like egg retrieval, like freezing their eggs, because then once they reach a point where in their careers where they're ready to have children, then they can, this is part of what they're offering their employees. And I think a lot of girls believe this, like there is no it's whenever you want, whenever you're ready. And I think unfortunately that's not the case. And I think we're lying to our girls, and that's something that I wish I would have thought of more. And so I think that's something I would say.
I would also add to stay away from birth control. Again, believing the lie that society tells us that we're in control. We take birth control for 10, 15 years, and then when we're ready to have kids, our bodies are all out of whack from taking such hormones for such a long time. And so our bodies are designed to be as God designed them, not to mess around with. And so I think that's another huge component.
But I just want to say that this happened here in Finley, and the importance of teaching girls chastity and celibacy, because this girl was 18 years old, she's had sexual contact. She ended up with endometriosis, at the age of 18, and she ended up having a hysterectomy at 18. Sad story.
Okay. Any other questions? Okay, we'd like to thank Angelique and Carmen. Thank you so much.